And now the ministry of the word. From Job 38, 1 through 18. Then the Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind. Who is this that darkens counsel by words without knowledge? Gird up your loins like a man. I will question you, and you shall declare to me. Where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth? Tell me if you have an understanding. Who determined its measurements? Surely you know. Or who stretched the line upon it? On what were its bases sunk, or laid its cornerstone? When the morning stars sang together and all the heavenly beings shouted for joy? Or who shut in the sea with doors when it burst out from the womb? When I made the clouds its garment and thick darkness its swaddling band, prescribed bounds for it, and set bars and doors, and said, thus far shall you come, and no farther. And here shall your proud waves be stopped. Have you commanded the morning since your days began, and caused the dawn to know its place, so that it might hold the skirts of the earth, and the wicked be shaken out of it? It is changed like clay under the seal, and it is dyed like a garment. Light is withheld from the wicked, and their uplifted arm is broken. Have you entered into the springs of the sea, or walked the recesses of the deep? Have the gates of death been revealed to you, or have you seen the gates of the deep darkness? Have you comprehended the expanse of the earth? Declare if you know all this.
Well, welcome to our quarterly Ask the Minister Sunday. If you wonder why I had Roger read that passage from Job, yes, well, it's because it certainly addresses God's point to Job that your knowledge is limited. Okay, so please remember that when you ask me your questions. Okay, this is the part where you ask me really legitimate, serious, insightful questions, and I respond by making up some nonsense off the top of my head. So, we had a number of questions sent in ahead of time. I will start with one of those, and then as we do, we try to alternate one that we already have and one that you may have brought with you. So, here we go. And I have the question cards next to the candle, because if I don't like the question, it may accidentally burn. You recently discussed some of the theological and spiritual foundations of the UCC with the men's and women's Shell Point groups. One of those you presented was that we take a both and rather than either or perspective. Can you review and expand on this? All right, so what I mean by that, and really not me, the denomination, because the denomination, the UCC, uses that term both and. To describe itself, is that it recognizes the fact that we are a spiritual tradition, as most of them are, that is built on a fair amount of paradox. Okay? The two things can be true at the same time. Two seemingly opposite things can be true at the same time. For instance, the Christian belief that Jesus was both human and divine. Fully human, fully divine. Okay? The idea within Christianity that we are both one at the same time, saints and sinners. Okay? Two things true at the same time. And so that is where that idea comes from. And so the UCC, again, and I'm speaking in generalities because each congregation is different, but the perspective from the UCC is that we try to look at things as much as possible from that both and perspective. Okay? One of the reasons is it avoids the kind of polarity and the kind of hostilities that we see, unfortunately, so frequently within religion and within our political culture at this point. It also recognizes the limits of our human understanding, our human intelligence, our individual perspectives. Okay, that what might be true for us may not be true for someone else or for some other group. And so, in a sense, it is a guardrail against hubris, against arrogance, either spiritually or theologically or biblically. So that's the essence of that. Okay. Your turn. Bruce?
Our name says that we are congregational and UCC. Is one more dominant in this age? Is one more historical from the past? Or how do these two come together?
Okay. Bruce asks that our name says we are both congregational and UCC. How does that work? Is one more important than the other? Is one more historical than the other? It's not a terribly complicated thing. The Congregational Church, that denomination, is one of four, and I won't go into a long history of the UCC. It is one of four smaller Protestant denominations that about 60 years ago merged to form the United Church of Christ. The Congregational Church, you may already know, more predominant in the Northeast, New England, some in Ohio, Pennsylvania, places like that. Again, one of the four denominations that merged to join the UCC. When churches joined the UCC, they had the option of either just simply changing their name to, Sanibel United Church of Christ, or keeping the name that reflected their heritage and joining it with the UCC name. Okay, so that's what this church did. Congregational United Church of Christ. It doesn't reflect anything more important than the other. It doesn't reflect a different kind of UCC, because there is no such thing as a uniform UCC church. We are all very different, all individually governed. Okay? You're welcome. Next card. How many religious beliefs are acquired by reason and knowledge gained from reading investigative writings versus instinct or unquestioning acceptance? It's a Cliff's Notes kind of answer, but it's not as complicated a question as it might seem. Because the real answer is there is no way to quantify that. There's no way to quantify it. Because each of us comes to our beliefs in our own particular way. We are talking in the current spiritual exploration unit on discipleship, pillars of discipleship. We talked about study recently and the ways that God reveals God's self to us. And we talked about two kinds of avenues of revelation. Okay, one being natural revelation, and what theologians mean by natural revelation is the ways that we connect with the divine through things like nature, or music, or art, or movies, or theater, or things like intuition, or reason, or most importantly, our individual experiences. Okay? And those are unique to us. However, we must also recognize, related to the last question a little bit, is that those are limited. Okay, they are limited to us for the most part. And so we must be careful to avoid saying, this is how it is for me, this is how I experience God, this is how God spoke to me this way, and making that, going from the specific to the general, and making that a generalization for all people, because that's not the way it works. Okay, the other thing that we've been talking about is this idea called multiple intelligences theory, which is simply the idea that we are wired neurologically. Our brains, our systems are wired differently for how we best receive and incorporate stimuli from the environment. Okay, for instance, some of us are perhaps more visual learners. Others are more auditory learners. Okay, others are more what's called kinesthetic learners. You learn by doing, hands-on. If you had an arbitrary scale of 0 to 10 for all of those forms, none of us is really a 0 in anything, or likely a 10 in anything. We fall somewhere along that spectrum. But we all tend to have one or two that are more dominant than others. And so the way we acquire our religious beliefs is this combination of how we best receive those kinds of connections from our environment and our experiences. Then the other kind of revelation that we've been talking about is based in Scripture, okay, the biblical text. Okay? We say God speaks to us through that. But again, interpretation matters. And so to say that the Bible means just this is I think a very risky thing and not a particularly spiritually helpful thing to do. To be able to read the Bible and to say, oh, well, that's obviously what it means. To do that without guidance, without understanding of context or history or anything else like that, certainly, again, limits the revelation that we get from it. Okay. Your turn. Frank?
Something I've looked into and seen different interpretations of it, and I'd like yours. As you know, the Jews with their midrash, they tend to modify certain interpretations of the Bible. The Christians, I think, do the same thing. And my question to you is, how and when did the early Christians decide that December 25th was to be Jesus' birthday?
Beats me. I can never keep that history straight in my mind. I believe it has to do with one of the emperors. Yeah, and the Roman calendar. Sorry, that's all I got.
I'll explain it to you later.
Okay. So you asked me a question you already knew the answer to. If you're going to do that, you have to come up and give the answer too. Yeah, those kinds of questions about Christianity, those classes in seminary, I just let that stuff. I don't even think we actually ever talked about it in seminary. So. Oh, card. It can be a personal question too, by the way. It doesn't have to be. I meant to mention that because a couple times people have done that because it's fair for you to know, what you need to know about the person who's up here. So, and if I don't want to answer, I just tell you, but pretty open about that. How can one make new friends and keep old ones in this world of polarity and diversity of thought? Well, again, there's no proven formula. But there are things which people who study these kinds of things for a living, or people who are involved in mediation or conflict resolution will suggest. Okay? So I will suggest a couple of those. The first is to ask questions. Okay? Maybe be a little bit less quick to want to blurt out our own opinions or our own positions, but instead ask questions of the other person. What kinds of questions? Open-ended questions. What? How? Why? Why do you believe such and such? How did you come to that belief? Those kinds of questions. Okay? One, we might learn something that helps us to interact with the person. And secondly, on the other side of it is that people are much less likely to get defensive, to get agitated in a conversation about something that's difficult or a conversation in which they disagree with you on when you do that. When instead of, just wanting to get your point across, you instead ask questions. Okay, questions tend to bring down the emotional level of the conversation. Okay? What they will tell you is what matters most in an interaction is trying to establish a relationship with the person. Again, what we find is it's a lot more difficult to get into a heated conversation or break off an interaction with someone that we know, that we feel we have a connection to. So it's the old adage, seek first to understand and then to be understood. The other thing that questions do for us is they make it possible for us to find points of common ground with the other person. And points of common ground at least allow the conversation to continue. And then when you get into areas of disagreement, again, much more possible for you to be able to continue the discussion. Okay? However, where's the water? Okay. And you probably have had this happen before. Sometimes it's just not possible. There is always a chance that you are going to reach an impasse with another person that you can't go over. You can't get by. And the reality is that sometimes it's necessary to move on. It's necessary to move on for both your sake and the other person's sake. It is, and then the last thing really in my mind, again, since we are members of a spiritual community, is, sometimes we simply have a choice between getting down in the mud or taking the high road. And I think we are called to take the high road. Okay. Yes, sir.
How was Christ as a politician?
How was Christ as a politician? I would say he was not a politician. I would say he had a political perspective. But I want to back up on that, okay? Because this discussion came up recently too with another group. When I use the term political in the context of what we do here, I'm referring to it in the ancient Greek context of the body politic, the idea of striving for the common good. I'm not talking about political parties or leaders or anything like that. So in that sense, did Jesus have a political perspective? Oh yeah, because everything that Jesus did was about the common good. And Jesus understood the common good to be living as individuals and as society and as a world in union with God and God's ways. But in terms of taking any kind of political sides or anything like that, I don't see any evidence in the Gospels that Jesus did that. Okay. In fact, he was executed by the rulers of his nation. So, yeah. Oh, Jack and then Joanne. Yeah.
In the Old Testament and New Testament and throughout history, especially today, the Jews have always been persecuted. Why is that?
Well, one, they're an easy target. Oh, I'm sorry. The question has to do with the fact that throughout history, the Jewish people have regularly been persecuted. Okay? And, Jack asked, well, why is that? Now that, a real solid answer to that will take way longer than the time that we have. But just some quick thoughts is, for one, they're an easy target in the sense that they have never been a world power. Okay? They're always been a small number of people in the large scheme of things, often a scattered people. Okay? I often make the comment about one of the things that really is fascinating to me about the Bible is that it is the story of the losers. Okay, and when you think about it, okay, it is the story of our ancient Jewish ancestors and the early Christian community, and neither of those was ever a dominant world power. Okay, it's very unusual, that representation. So yeah, there's, part of it is they've been an easy target, and secondly, unfortunately, we're responsible. We're largely responsible for that in Christianity. Okay, it is Christianity that first, and in terms of the long scheme of history, has had the most influence on those negative perceptions of Judaism and the persecution of Judaism. The early Christian church and going forward for the first few centuries was very anti-Semitic. I mean, we didn't get a statement from the Pope rejecting anti-Semitism until what, 30 years ago? 40 years ago? So yeah, we got to own that. Okay, we talk about in the United States, we talk about slavery being our country's original sin. Well, in Christianity, I think anti-Semitism is our original sin. Okay? And that sprung out of the conflict between the two spiritual communities as Christianity grew and the two started to move apart. And then from there, because Christianity was so much larger than Judaism, that was the dynamic that occurred. And then, of course, the other thing is with the Middle East situation is the dispute over land that's been going on forever. So, again, a very short answer to a very complex thing. Joanne?
You said it was all right to ask personal questions. Did you ever have an aha moment?
Okay, Joanne asked if I ever had an aha moment. Can I ask you to say a little bit more about what you mean?
No. I believe, I accept that some people have had all of a sudden they become instantaneous Christians.
Oh, okay, I got you. Did I ever have a Christian aha moment? No. I grew up in the church. I grew up in a Catholic church. I had very devout Catholic parents. I always say that my mother was the greatest example of Christianity I have ever, been privileged to have, because we did the rituals, we did all of those things, but it was sort of the way of life, the way she lived, the way she was with other people, that kind of thing. So yeah, I grew up in the church. My late oldest brother was a Catholic priest. Okay. Fun fact. So I really never had that. I mean, and again, I talked a little while ago about multiple intelligences and that we're all sort of wired differently. Another branch of cognitive science that really fascinates me is what's called neurotheology. The idea that we are wired, each of us wired to some degree for this desire to connect with and seek out the divine. If that is true, then I think I was kind of high on that scale, because I remember that part of me from the time I was 5 or 6 years old. It was never an aha thing. But like a lot of people, it sort of ebbed and flowed depending on my life circumstances and what I was doing. And like a lot of people in college, I kind of, fell away a little bit. But that never left me, that spirituality side. But then it came back, and then as I started to really get serious about those things and do a lot of reading and research and talking and things like that, I just felt that the Catholic tradition, as grateful as I was to it for the upbringing, to me it wasn't the best representation of either the Gospels or my own spirituality. And so that eventually led me to the UCC. And then to here. Sorry. What?
Was your mother unhappy?
Oh, boy, we're getting real personal. Yikes. Actually, I don't mind answering that. Actually, I love to answer that question. It is possibly my favorite story about my mother. Okay? So when I decided to go into the ministry, my mother was 82, somewhere in there, early 80s. And I had, of course, there were a lot of people I had to tell that I was making this transition. And, some I was concerned about, some I wasn't. I was petrified of telling my mother what I was going to do. But had to do it. So I went up, and she was living alone in a senior apartment at that point, and went by myself and stopped in. I said, I'm coming up for a couple days, and which was not unusual. And went up, and we got settled in, and said, got something to tell you. And I told her, and her response, she waited a couple seconds, and then she said, well, it's going to take me a little bit to get used to, but I certainly can't argue with it. I said, I'll take that. So, all right, I'm going back to the cards before any more of that stuff. Oof. You mentioned agape love in a recent message and its relationship to feelings. What is the relationship of those two, agape and feelings? And if I feel open-hearted, is that not agape? Okay. All right, and actually we talked about this last week, last Sunday in that message, the idea that from a Christian spiritual perspective, love, okay, the word we use as love comes from, and there's many different forms of that word in Greek. The one that most frequently occurs in the New Testament is a Greek word agape for love. And that essentially is selfless love. And as that is understood in the Christian spiritual tradition, as we talked about last Sunday, that is not rooted in emotion. It's not a feeling. It's not emotion. It is independent of feeling and emotion. The idea being that we are called to live as Christ calls us to model Jesus in terms of our treatment of other people, regardless of how we feel about them. Okay? In other words, love then is an act, a behavior, a way of being in the world. So, on the one hand, feeling open-hearted towards someone is not agape. However, to be open-hearted towards another person certainly makes agape a lot more likely. Okay? Your turn. Yes, Dick.
Is Judaism a religion or a way of life?
Is Judaism a religion or a way of life, is the question. Yes. Yes, as I understand religion, it is both, just as I believe Christianity is both. Here we go, both and, right? Yes, the same for Christianity, religion and way of life. The same for Buddhism. Buddhists will tell you. The Dalai Lama has said it's not really, Buddhism isn't really a religion. It's a way of life. But again, depending on if you understand religion in its root as being to reconnect, okay, or to connect with the divine, okay, then that is a way of life. Or it should be a way of life. Because it's not like, as we know, our spiritual lives are not one and done. We don't have that aha moment and it's over, we're good. Okay? It is a lifelong journey, as we've been talking about in the discipleship unit on Tuesdays. So discipleship, by its very nature, means to travel with, okay, or to walk with on a path. So it implies a way of life. So yes, the answer is yes. It is both and. Yeah.
Think AI will solve any spiritual questions?
Do I think AI will solve any spiritual questions? I don't know enough about AI to really have an answer to that. All I can probably say is if we consider history and what history has told us about sort of new things like that and where they take us, the answer would be maybe, it might, but at the same time, it might create more problems. It will likely create new questions as well as possibly solve old ones. But I have no crystal ball on that one. Yeah, and I am definitely not a tech, I'm not geared that way. Looking back at last week's scripture and message, I wonder where you stand on the issue of the death penalty, or even life imprisonment without parole. No, actually, I don't. I've held the same position on that for some time. I believe, as a Christian minister, I cannot be an advocate for the capital punishment, for the death penalty. Okay. Now, that's a spiritual, biblical, theological decision for me. But I also have been researching and been involved in, groups that deal with this for a while now. And what the research suggests from a more practical perspective is that the reasons given to support capital punishment don't necessarily hold up. For one, we're told that it's a deterrent, and there's no evidence to suggest that it actually acts as a deterrent. Okay? Another is, has to do with just basic economics. Well, what research also shows is that when you factor in the often years-long appeals process, it costs more to execute someone than to keep them imprisoned for life. And then the other thing, and again, for me, this is more of a moral and ethical position, is considering what we have found with the advancements in DNA research, for instance, with what we have found with those advancements, that there are a lot more people who are on death row than should be, who did not actually commit those crimes, which means, therefore, just by reasoning, which means that we have executed people who should not have been executed in the past. Again, this is just my own moral, ethical position, is if the state is going to claim that right, it needs to be darn certain. And if we can't have that kind of a standard where we are certain, then we need to think twice about it. Okay. And then, of course, there's the biblical perspective that we follow someone who was executed by the state. And I think we need to keep that in mind as well. As for life without parole, I find that less problematic. I do understand the society's right to enact justice, to do things like that, and to protect itself from someone who could create further harm if allowed out. Again, though, that is in tension with our understanding of a God who is a God of second chances. Well, I don't know. I'm still wrestling with that one. What that means for that person. Whether the second chance is to change their lives and contribute to making things better while in prison, as opposed to being allowed out. Okay. All right, one more and then we're going to stop. Yep.
I had an encounter once a long time with a celebrity roller, you know, and I'm wondering what your view is, and everybody's just looking at me, what your view is on angels and archangels, and how they fit in with praying for them, or praying, you know, I'm a little bit mixed up about all that.
Yeah, me too. I'm trying to get the question to a place where I can, because I'm not quite sure what you're asking me, how I feel about them.
What's your viewpoint on angels, and are they real? Do they really come down? And I know they're in Christianity and in Judaism, but what do you do, you know, if you encounter one?
I don't know. I don't know. I don't even know how I feel or perceive the entire thing. I believe that God communicates with us. I believe that can happen in a number of ways. So essentially, I guess what I'm saying is, I don't discount. I have not had an experience like that. I don't discount it. But at the same time, I don't know how to address it, because I have not experienced it for myself. But I know others who have made that same claim. And it certainly is a large part of our tradition for a long, long time. So it does make me think that there's something happening. How that manifests itself, I don't know. I can't say for sure.
Well, sorry for the nebulous.
Oh, no, it's a great question. And it's not the first time I've been asked that. I just don't have a better answer, or a more definitive one. All right. Thanks, folks. We survived another one.